Welcome back to Real Love, Real Stories, TV and podcast. This is Kanu. I am the host. Thanks again for tuning in. And you're tuning in to bonus episode where I'm continuing discussion with Pastor Frank, my pastor here from a church that I go to here in Phoenix, Arizona. So we're talking about premarital counseling. Enjoy. Welcome, Pastor Frank. I am so excited that you're here to talk to us. We're talking about, is it important to do premarital counseling?
Yeah.
So maybe diving right into it, what are your thoughts about that? Is it important for a couple to do that?
I think it's really helpful.
Right.
Whether or not it's important, I think, will depend on the couple's application of what they learn in premarital counseling.
Right.
I remember when we sat together and looked at the responses that you had on Facebook to whether or not people did premarital and what was it helpful.
Right.
And some of the responses were, it kind of broke my heart because I think that the expectation of what should happen in premarital counseling and what premarital counseling should do was either miscommunicated or misapplied.
Right.
So I think that that's the biggest problem with premarital counseling. Premarital counseling is never going to solve your problems. It's not going to make two people that are ultimately incompatible compatible.
Right.
It's just not going to fix problems. Good premarital counseling is going to alert you to the problems that every single marriage is going to have.
Right.
And be aware of them and be ready to work through them and talk about them.
Yeah.
It's also potentially going to alert you to things that you didn't necessarily know about your potential spouse that,
right.
that might be a deal breaker.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe to give it a little bit of context about the Facebook post that you talked about, and if we get time at the end, we'll discuss some of those comments that people made. But I posted on Facebook and just asked a group that I belong to saying, are you married? Are you engaged? Have you gone through premarital counseling before? What did you like or gain from that? And, would you recommend it, sort of thing? So, and we'll touch on some of those comments because I thought, you mentioned they were kind of heartbreaking, and I agree. But, they were interesting to know actually where, what people feel about premarital counseling. So, yeah. So I know that you have, some topics that you go through, but maybe we should talk about if a couple, and I know you do counseling only for folks that go to your church.
Correct.
So what does that look like? First of all, when is the right time for a couple to come to you and say, we need premarital counseling?
Well, timing is interesting because I've actually done some, quote, premarital counseling after the wedding is done too.
Oh, interesting.
Because of timing.
Right.
Because of awareness. But I've also done a number of couples where they haven't gotten engaged yet, but they're talking about it. And they thought maybe we ought to go through the premarital counseling before we go through the trouble of getting engaged and making all those plans, which I think is pretty wise to do that.
I like that a lot, actually. Yeah.
But the vast majority of them are people who get engaged and then believe that they would benefit from some help talking about marriage before they actually are married. Yeah. And that's the bulk. I would say 85 to 90% of the couples that I meet with are engaged and are they have a date and they're pointing toward a date.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what, whether it's church or regular counseling, that's what usually couples go to seek premarital counseling after they have been engaged. But I am actually thinking like that 5% that you talked about where they come to you before they even get to be engaged. In my opinion, I feel like that is the right time to do that, especially when you're starting to get serious with this person and you know that it's coming. So I feel like that's the right time to start having this. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so walk us through what that looks like. A couple is engaged or they're thinking about getting engaged. What happens when they come to you and say we need premarital counseling?
So the first thing I do is I set up a meeting with them in a more casual and relaxed atmosphere where we just get to know each other.
Mm-hmm.
And my first thing is, it's interesting what your podcast is called. My first thing is I want to hear their stories.
Right.
I love to hear somebody's story.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to hear both of their stories and then how they met and
mm-hmm.
what they found that clicked for them.
Yeah.
But then I also make it clear to them that I want them to interview me.
Oh, interesting.
To make sure that what I'm going to do for them is really what they're looking for, and they believe will be helpful.
Oh, I like that.
You know, because I spend, after that, if we go forward with it after that initial meeting,
mm-hmm.
which usually involves a latte or tea or something.
Yeah.
But after we go through that meeting, it's going to be 6 sessions at least, sometimes 7 or 8.
Okay.
But at least 6 sessions. There's 6 sessions that are planned that are anywhere from 45 to 75 minutes, depending on how chatty we get. And some couples just primarily sit and listen. Other couples are very involved with the material and interact quite a bit. So it depends. But that's a lot of time, including travel time and scheduling time.
Yeah.
Most couples, both of them are working.
Oh, yeah.
So you run into that challenge. So that's a lot of effort to put into something that you're not sure if I'm the right person
right.
or if what you're going to get out of it is going to be helpful. So I try to help them understand you need to interview me.
You know, I like that a lot because I'm thinking again back to those Facebook comments that we talked about. Most of the people that commented were like, I didn't like what the guy or the lady said
mm-hmm.
in terms of like their way of counseling. So I think that's the missing piece that when you say mm-hmm. that, I just realized probably the missing piece for most of those people. Yeah. Because they didn't get a chance to interview, you know, whoever was doing the mm-hmm. premarital counseling for them. So.
And you said, you know, because of the demographic of our church, it's impossible for me to do premarital with anybody outside of our church. I just don't have the time or the bandwidth. And this is my community. These are the people I'm in relationship with anyway.
Yeah.
But I will also tell you that there have been people who have interviewed me and they've said, nah, probably not going to work for us.
From church?
Yeah. So that's good.
But hey,
you headed off the problem before it ever started. So not every person that I meet with initially is necessarily going to want me to do that. Yeah. We also have a couple of other guys on the pastoral staff here who do it as well. And sometimes they ask the other guys to do it as well. So
yeah, it's nice that they have
mm-hmm.
options. Yeah, that's awesome. So, so let's say they interview you and they're happy with, you know, what your process is and you're happy with them and you're, you know, schedule those sessions to talk to them about premarital counseling. What are some of the things that you talk about?
So my background is in theology and communication theory,
mm-hmm.
and I teach communication theory, but I'm not a clinician. So that's important to understand right up front. So this is more pastoral.
Mm-hmm.
This is more of a shepherding kind of thing, but it mixes a lot of theology with social sciences.
Okay.
And so what I tell them is that there's 6 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
There's essentially 2 homework assignments that aren't too terribly difficult to do.
Yeah.
That I take them through. The option is left open for a 7th session to discuss things that I never got around to that they seem to think is a potential issue.
Okay.
And so the first time we get together, we talk about what I call the 4 truths of a gospel-centered marriage, a marriage that is focused on the reality of God as a redeemer.
Right.
So we talk about that, and that's like the foundation for everything else.
Okay.
And then the second time, I also give them their first, I give them both their homework assignments at that point. I asked them to read Tim and Kathy Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage, which is very helpful. I've read hundreds of books on marriage, Christian books, non-Christian books, social science books.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is, if there's one book to read on marriage, that would be it.
Yeah.
So I asked them to read it or listen to it.
Right. And we will include like a link to purchase that book for any listeners who may be interested in that as well. Yeah.
So that book is really helpful. It's so comprehensive. It even has a chapter on singleness,
Oh.
which I think is fantastic.
Okay.
Which is really helpful. Not everybody is destined to get married or should get married or wants to get married or needs to get married. Our founding pastor has a saying about marriage I think is really helpful. Anyone is not better than no one. And maybe some people need to think about that.
Oh, wow. Yes.
The marriage has become and can become such an idol in a person's life that they end up with somebody that is way worse than being with nobody.
Wow.
There is a reality to that.
Yeah.
So anyway, the other one is I ask each individual separate from each other to make a list of what we would call false gods or idols, but practically what they are things in their life that are important to them.
Right.
And generally, they're really good things. It's not that they're bad things. So career, the acquisition of wealth, fame, power, status, those things are not necessarily bad. We're not anti-ambition. But when we human beings decide that those things are going to become what we believe will ultimately fulfill us in an existential and eternal way, we're placing our faith and trust in something that can't do that for us. Right. It's not that they're bad things, but when they become the ultimate thing, they do become bad things.
Right.
And I ask each potential spouse to be honest about what those things are in their life so that they're more self-aware of it. Maybe they've never even thought about that themselves. Maybe my career is way too important to me. It'll get in the way of my relationship with my spouse in an unhealthy way, and I need to think about that. And my potential spouse needs to know that that's a potential barrier. In the church, I think we talk a lot about how false gods or idols get in the way of our relationship with God. I don't think we talk about how false gods or idols or these items get in the way of our horizontal relationships in an unhealthy way. So I want them to do that. They do it separately, and then we come together and just have a conversation. That's one of the sessions, is we just have a conversation about those things.
Yeah.
Other pastors I know have said, I want you to make a list of the top 10 things that you enjoy the most about your life. That's another way of saying it.
Oh, okay.
So you can do that.
And then you can get that from
you can pull it out of that. I just ask, I say, here's the definition of a false god, according to Stuart Scott's book, and now come up with your top 3 or 4 or 5 that you think potentially could be a false god. But there's other ways of framing that. Right.
Yeah. So, I didn't think of it in that way until you framed it the other way. And that totally makes sense. Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. So,
that's like session 1. Session 2 is we have that conversation about the idols.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to see there's usually a vertical thread between the person's 3 or 4 idols. There's like an underlying motivator, usually insecurity or a fear of insignificance or something that's generally fear-based. Again, fear is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can drive us to really dysfunctional and unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah.
But fear is also a good thing because it gets us out of bed in the morning sometimes,
Yeah.
Anyway, Brene Brown talks a lot about that. The fear of scarcity and how that motivates us. I think that's helpful. But also the horizontal, you begin to say, okay, this is really important in your life, maybe almost in an unhealthy way. Your potential spouse has this thing over here. Those things seem a little related. You better be careful of that.
Right. Yeah.
So you can have that conversation.
Yeah.
Second time we get together, we talk about something called attraction theory, generally how you got together in the first place.
Right.
It's defined through research. And it's always interesting to talk to a couple about being able to say, well, here's the reason why you behave this way with each other. And they're like, oh yeah, that's true. That's the beauty of really good social science research is you can start to understand why we do the things that we do.
Right.
So we talk about that. And then we have this other discussion about, okay, now you know how you got together. Now you need to talk about these things that will help you to stay together.
Yeah.
And these are things that generally people don't think about discussing and engaging necessarily before they get married. And then they're in the middle of it.
Right.
And suddenly they realize they have some different life philosophies about really important topics that they never talked about. And that causes problems.
Oh, immediately conflict for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the 3rd and 4th sessions, we look at some biblical texts about marriage. And then the 5th session, we worked through a list of some colleagues of mine and I a few years ago, guys like me who do this, and then also will do marriage retreats and conferences and stuff. On occasion, we actually put together a list of, it's not comprehensive and it's not the only list, but it's a list of what we think are the top 10 issues that married couples will face. So we talk about that. And again, not for the purpose of solving those issues, but just to say, you need to be aware of this.
Right.
These are going to come up.
Yeah.
So when I'll go and teach at a marriage retreat, couples that have been married for a while, they'll invariably come up to me afterwards and say, oh yeah, all 10 of those are true. But if there's a couple there that's engaged and they're at the marriage retreat, which by the way is very proactive and very helpful, you know, they'll come up and go, yeah, I could see where maybe 5 of those might be a challenge, but we're never going to have the problem with the other 5. So, just you wait. You know? And then the 6th time we get together, we go through, really, this is a 30,000 foot flyover. There's so much more detail to this that of course I teach in a college setting, but it's helpful. Anyway, just for 75 minutes, I talk about relationship stages, some relationship theories, things like attribution theory, things like positive and negative ambiguity. Some of the work of John Gottman, which is brilliant. You can find all kinds of Gottman stuff, as you know, on YouTube, on the internet. And then we work through conflict resolution, styles and strategies, and behaviors.
Oh, wow.
So conflict resolution has been framed by some scholars as styles and strategies, very helpful, but others have framed it more like John Gottman would frame it, as behaviors.
Okay.
And I found that even more helpful.
Okay.
Because that speaks directly to what behaviors I do in conflict resolution that are unhelpful and what behaviors I could develop that would be more helpful.
Yeah.
And so we work through that, and I have little handouts and stuff for the spouses. But I also have had experience, like profound benchmark, you might call it a come to Jesus moment experience, when I was looking at these behaviors and realizing the number of unhealthy behaviors in the past that I would engage in that were destructive. But I was so determined to win, you know, and realizing that doesn't do you any good.
No, not at all.
And that I should be learning about and incorporating these cooperative behaviors that are much better. So we talk about that. So that's kind of the 6 sessions, you know, not a lot about finances. Sometimes we'll do a 7th session where they say, okay, we really want to talk about what you think about finances and money and how to handle that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have another session to talk about in-laws and extended family and some of the challenges there.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Which comes up
right
in the first 6 sessions, but we just don't go deep.
Yeah. But it's good to bring it to the surface to get them to think about that.
Sure.
Wow, this is a lot of information, and it sounds like, you know, you would almost need a whole year of like going through all this. But kudos to you for condensing it into a few sessions that, you know.
Well, one of the things that Tim Keller says in his book, which I think is really helpful, and every new married couple should hear, is that he says it takes you about 10 years just to learn how to be married. So that first 10 years is almost going to be like a laboratory. Oh, and even then, there's no guarantee it's going to be wonderful.
Right.
You know, but that first 10 years is like you're working through things. There's experiments. There's all kinds of new external pressures that you'd never anticipated. So
and I think it goes down to that I've heard where it says, you know, most marriages actually end in the first 7 years.
Right.
If you go past the 7-year age, you're good.
You're good until about 25 years. Then there's a little bit of a spike there too. And what I've read about that is that the reason it spikes a little bit at 25 years is because of around 25 years is because of empty nest.
Oh yeah, that's a big one too.
Couples suddenly don't have kids living at home.
No,
they've invested so much in their kids and not enough in their relationship. Now they're looking at each other and saying, now what? And they're not that interested. You know?
Oops. Yeah. Yeah, wow. So I love all these things that you talk talk to your couples about. So shall we get into some of the comments that Facebook?
Absolutely.
So I posted on Facebook, I think it's been a month ago, and I just posted, are you married? Are you engaged? Have you gone through premarital counseling? What did you gain from it? And what did you learn about your partner that you didn't know? And so the first comment, somebody says, I'm married. I was working at Sony when we got engaged, and I saw they offered free counseling as part of their employee assistance program. So I figured he and I could get some free premarital counseling. And then she says, keep in mind, we had already been together 8 years. So we make an appointment to see the shrink, she calls him. And we sit with him for about 10 minutes, and he says, you guys are fine. And says, nothing to worry about. And then they see him about 5 more times, and all he talks about is his wife and his family and where to buy a house. So what would you say to that person who went through that?
It doesn't sound like they've necessarily developed any sort of a plan or curriculum that deals specifically with that idea of you're going to get married now and merge your.
Right.
Okay, even if you've been living together, you need to understand that marriage still changes the game. You're still merging things that weren't merged before, and that's going to create issues. So, so anyway, I don't think that this person had a plan or a methodology for dealing with this specific issue.
Right.
And either maybe that's not their wheelhouse. That's fine.
Yeah.
There's some things that I can't. Somebody will come to me and say, hey, can you help me with this? And I'll say, I'm the wrong person. You need,
Right.
So maybe direct them somewhere else or develop that methodology.
Yeah, to me, I loved how you talked about first that it's sort of an interview process at first to see if you're a good fit.
Right.
This would have worked
probably
out.
Not.
And they probably wouldn't have gone through with it.
Right.
Yeah, and I like this one. This next comment came. It says she's married. They didn't go through counseling, but she wishes they would have. That her husband does not talk about how he feels, and I think someone else leading the conversation would help.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, your thoughts about that one?
Yeah. So again, that's something that if somebody's kind of bottled up, there's a difference between being introverted and just not being able to talk about things that are really difficult. So if that's going to become a problem, maybe that'll come out during the premarital counseling.
Right.
So again, like I say, all through the sessions, and then at the end I say, all right, what haven't we talked about that you need to talk about? And if there's a sense by the spouse that, he's not talking about some things.
Yeah.
Okay, then we can say, well, he's not talking about some things, and I'd like to talk about that.
Right.
Here's the issue there, though. It's probable, more than possible, it's even probable that what he needs somebody who's specifically trained in counseling, psychology, to help him to go deep with that stuff.
Yeah.
And that just a pastoral counseling isn't necessarily going to draw that out.
Yeah. So outside of just, you're right.
So we have, I wouldn't call them partnerships, but we have people that we know are good clinicians that we will say, look,
you need to go to this person.
Yeah, I have empathy and compassion for you, but you need to have somebody who's been trained in this, to talk to you about this.
Yeah, no, it's important to. So this last comment was from somebody who said they went through premarital counseling and they were barely 21. They went through it, got really good information, but did not use it because they were not mature enough to use it.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening in the couples that you see sometimes?
Oh, yeah. And that's true in all of life. How many of us know what we need to do, but we don't do it?
Yeah.
It's just true in all of life. It's Jackie, my wife, who's an ACE certified group fitness instructor, and she's into nutrition and exercise, all this stuff. And I'm a distance runner. I like running. But she's constantly telling me, you gotta work on your core. You gotta work on your core.
To strengthen.
And I'm like, core schmore. But I know I gotta work on my core.
Right.
I know I do. So I know that working on my core would be really important.
Right.
I just don't do it. So I shouldn't complain that my core stinks.
Right, when you've not worked on it.
Right. So, but that's just true in all of life.
Yeah.
You know, we tend toward entropy and atrophy rather than toward what's going to really help build us up. That's the discipline of life.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll do this one last one. This person says, married and had premarital counseling. It was lame. I was 30, he was 31, and we had already been married, divorced. We both were successful in our careers and had our money situation pretty well sorted out. The premarital counseling we did was so focused on a younger couple who either had never managed their own money or would never had to stand up to their parents, that the whole thing felt silly for us. Yeah,
so all of the comments that we've read together and the ones that you've brought here in their own context are really insightful and important. Mm-hmm. That might be the best.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's gold right there. And the reason I say that is because we do a lot of our premarital here that I do. They're young people, never been married before, never had to merge a life with anybody before. You know, that's true. We have also quite a number of people who are getting married in their 40s and 50s, some in their late 30s who haven't been married before, but they're already like very successful in their career. That's a whole different context than doing premarital for people in their early to mid 20s that are just kind of getting started. And so the stuff that we go through does apply, but you have to nuance it toward those new contexts, those differing contexts. And some places you don't even nuance it. You just either don't do it or you completely change how you're going to talk about it. So that's really insightful. You can't take premarital counseling for a couple of 23-year-olds just getting started and apply it to their situation. It's not going to be very helpful. Work, She's right. For some reason, I'm assuming it's a she.
Yeah, it's a she.
Okay. She's right. That's probably pretty lame.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't mean to be pejorative. I'm just saying, you know, you got to know your context. You got to know your audience and who you're talking to.
Absolutely.
I think that's important.
Tweak it to who you're giving the information to. Yeah. So this was a lot of fun. I'm so grateful that you took time to chat with me and, you know, provide information for my listeners. So I'm so grateful for that. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to go to iTunes. You can subscribe, rate, and write a review. And also, you can always find more information about any of the episodes on my website, www.realloverealstories.com. And remember to follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and it's all under Real Love, Real Stories. Till next time.